So now that we've got all the logistics out of the way, I just want to say that I'm really excited to welcome our researchers from UC Davis, who will share valuable insights from their study exploring how travel demand and the built environment influence access to zero-emission vehicles, or ZEVs, in underserved communities across California. As the California Air Resources Board works to implement the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations, which require that 100% of new car sales be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, it is essential that we ensure all Californians have equitable access to these vehicles. Expanding ZEV access in historically underserved communities is particularly important. Doing so will help these communities experience the air quality benefits of cleaner transportation and gain access to new economic opportunities enabled by improved mobility options. This research includes one of the first large-scale surveys to randomly sample households in California's priority populations, which include disadvantaged communities, low-income tracts, and tribal census tracts, to understand their unique challenges and perspectives on ZEVs. So I'm thrilled to introduce our 3 speakers today. We have Scott Hardman, Associate Research Faculty and Assistant Director of the Electric Vehicle Research Center at UC Davis, Kelly Hoogland, graduate student researcher at the Electric Vehicle Research Center, also at UC Davis, and finally, Maha Shafin, graduate student researcher, Electric Vehicle Research Center at UC Davis. So I welcome all 3 of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Scott to begin the presentations today.
Thank you, Lisa, and morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining this webinar. So before I sort of get into the research, I just want to highlight all these people who are kind of named here, all the help and contributions they did. So just Kelly, Maha, and I are going to be speaking, but a lot of work from a lot of different people went into this project, including people from UC Davis, the Green Lining Institute, Self-Help Enterprises, and Transform. So I just want to acknowledge all the help and contributions of everybody to this research. So I'll give a little bit of an intro to the project. I'll talk a little bit about some kind of general patterns on vehicle ownership. Then I'll hand over to Maha, who's going to talk about perceptions, knowledge, and consideration of electric vehicles. And then I'll pass on to Kelly, who will talk a little bit about which policies can help increase consideration to buy an electric vehicle. And then finally, we'll give some kind of final thoughts before we go to a Q&A. So yeah, as kind of Lisa highlighted, we are making pretty good progress towards our goals of 100% EV sales in 2035. So far this year, I think 1 in 4 electric vehicles in the state are electric. So progressing pretty well. But we do know that the sort of adoption of electric vehicles has not necessarily been evenly distributed throughout the state. We also know infrastructure is not evenly distributed, and as a result of that, kind of the benefits of EVs, which is clean air, that's also not evenly distributed yet. Those things are improving, but we're not there yet. And so kind of the hope of this study was we could inform how we can sort of make EV adoption, ownership, and so on more evenly distributed, and so that everybody can experience the benefits of them. And so just as an example of that, on the right, we have the number of electric vehicles per 1,000 people in different census tracts. And you can see this sort of non-priority census tracts, which are tracts that are not underserved or not disadvantaged. They have about 1 to 2 times as many electric vehicles in those tracts as they do in other areas, which are like these state priorities. And at the same time, we know infrastructure is not evenly distributed. We know that higher income households have more access to charging from home, primarily because they own their homes or they live in a single family home. And so, these are kind of some things we want to be thinking about as we try and make this transition more inclusive of everybody. Okay, so onto the project. The aim was pretty broad. It was to understand the mobility needs of underserved communities and understand whether and how electric vehicles can meet that need. It was quite a long project. It was about 2.5 years. We had a lot of different research questions, I think 5 in total. We can't go into all of them today, but if you want to read the report, that will go into all these things in more detail. So today we just decided to focus on 2 things. One, what is the state of awareness, knowledge, and perceptions of electric vehicles in these communities that we're studying? And also, what could we do to increase EV adoption in these communities? And the scope of this when we talk about underserved communities or disadvantaged communities. We're specifically talking about the state's definition of priority populations, which is households living in disadvantaged census tracts, tribal census tracts, low-income census tracts, as well as low-income households living in non-sort of disadvantaged areas. And so all of the data collection efforts focus on this specific population. And then the methods we used were listening sessions, kind of like focus groups. We held 7 sessions. Half of them were in the Central Valley, half of them in the Bay Area, and we also did a mix of virtual and in-person sessions. And the sessions started off quite broad. We first started talking to people about their sort of general travel experiences, how they get around, their needs, and then we moved on to electric vehicles. And as part of that, we give people like a 10 to 15-minute presentation to give them the basics of EVs, so that we could have a more detailed and in-depth discussion. We also spoke to these communities about what they would like to see investments in. And then after that, we did a survey throughout the state in these priority populations. We sent the survey to a random sample of 80,000 households who we identified using the US Postal Service database. And then we sent the survey via email, via mail, and also physical mail surveys. And we have about 3,000 respondents from these different communities that we're interested in. And the survey, we'll just focus on what is shown in bold here, but the survey had questions about travel behavior, people's household vehicle ownership and how they tend to buy vehicles, the knowledge, perceptions, and consideration of EVs, as well as having this survey experiment, which Kelly will talk about, where we test different policies and how they can sort of encourage EV adoption. And then we also had questions on what people want to see investments in, as well as the standard sort of demographic variables that you kind of ask people about. Okay, so I'll just dive straight into the results. So I am going to focus, the three of us are going to focus only on electric vehicles, but I just want to mention this briefly. Since we are trying to do community engaged research, one sort of key part of that is rather than us sort of prescribing solutions to people, is like asking them what they want. And we did that in the listening sessions, and we also did that in the survey. And I'm just sort of showing one slide here, summarizing some data from the survey, where we asked people to rank these investments from the lowest to the highest priority for them and their household. And you can kind of see that the highest priority for these group of households throughout the state is investments in transit and investments in walking. This is from the survey, but we heard very similar things from the listening sessions. So those are kind of like the two things that people wanted to see the most. And then electric vehicles is also here, and that was like the 4th ranked priority that people wanted to see. So it's kind of just some context of what people really want. Okay, now onto the listening sessions. So the first thing we do in the sessions, before we even mention anything about electric vehicles, I said we do a presentation. Before we get to that, we just say to people, like, what do you know about them? Have you heard of them? And this is kind of one extract from the listening sessions that's kind of serves as an example of what the state of kind of knowledge of EVs is throughout the state. So one of our facilitators, JC, who's a researcher at the EV Center, said, what do you know about electric vehicles? To one of the sessions, someone said, I have no clue. I have not heard about them. Someone said, I've heard of them, but I don't know of them. And then someone said, like a Tesla, isn't that all electric? And so I think this kind of summarizes quite nicely the kind of level of knowledge people had in these sessions. There were a few EV owners who, of course, had good knowledge, but on the most part, a lot of people weren't really that knowledgeable or engaged with EVs. And in actually one of our sessions, which was, I think it was about 10 or 11 people, not a single person in that session had heard about electric vehicles before we had asked them about it. I think it's useful to, we're all very engaged in this transition, but a lot of people aren't yet. That being said, though, as we went through this listening session, as we shared information about electric vehicles and kind of spoke about them for an hour and a half, people did become much more interested. And so this was from a session, quote from a session in Visalia. And at the end, someone just said, thank you. You sparked a flame in my head. I'm going to do some research. I'm interested in buying an EV. Someone else said, me too. So I think that kind of demonstrates that while there is low knowledge and awareness of EVs, people tend to be quite amenable to them if you spend the time engaging with them. However, there are still real barriers. So this is a kind of a summary of the main barriers we detected in the sessions, and they're kind of shown in order of how much they were spoken about. And so the thing people spoke about the most was the lack of public charging infrastructure in their communities. Equally so, these two were kind of joint first. People also spoke about the lack of home charging access, either because they live in an older home, they live in a rented home, they live in an apartment, or they just don't have a place that they think they could easily plug in at home. And next was cost. People still perceived electric vehicles were unaffordable, both new and used electric vehicles. People also had concerns about batteries. They were concerned about battery degradation. And then the final thing we kind of saw was people didn't really perceive there to be a benefit of electric vehicle. They didn't quite understand why they should buy an electric vehicle. And that was mainly due to the relatively low cost of gasoline compared to the cost of electricity, which we know is quite high, which kind of in some cases can give you a similar cost per mile to drive an EV as a gas car. So people weren't sure why they would buy an electric vehicle. Okay, now on to the survey. So the first thing, just to give some background about how people travel, as you would expect with a survey of Californians, most people do drive most of the time. So, oops, sorry. This is just, we ask about the use of all modes, but this is just showing how frequently people walk at the top, how frequently people drive in the middle, and how frequently people take transit. And so a good % of people are walking regularly as a mode of transport, but the most common mode we saw in the survey was driving. So about 80% of respondents drive every week. And then transit use was pretty low. Only like 7% were using transit every week, which I think is a combination of not having access to it and people sort of often choosing to drive. Now on to some vehicle ownership. So the average number of vehicles in this sample was 2, which is just a little bit less than the statewide average in California, which is slightly over 2. And then here we're showing whether or not the vehicle that is most commonly used by the respondent on the left is a new or used vehicle, and on the right is whether or not the household typically buys new or used vehicles. So it's pretty split. Slightly more people had reported the car that they use the most is a new vehicle, either purchased or leased. But people reported typically buying used vehicles, a higher proportion typically reported buying used vehicles, which again is similar to what you would expect for the state. In terms of the vehicles people own, most people owned a conventionally fueled vehicle, either a hybrid vehicle or just a conventional gasoline vehicle. About 90% owned a gas car. 6% did own a BEV, and about just over 2% owned a plug-in hybrid. So just over 8% of these households have some form of electric vehicle, which again is that's a little bit lower that you would expect for the statewide average. Something like 5% of all the cars in California are EVs, and about 10% of the households own an electric vehicle. So a little bit lower than what you would expect. And then the final thing I'll mention in terms of sort of vehicle purchase and owning is where people buy cars from. And I think this is something that's important to think about when we are designing incentive programs in particular. So on the left, we have where people buy new cars. And as you would expect, most people buying a new car, they buy it from a dealership. And on the right is where people buy used cars. And that's much more split. So about a third of people buy it from a private owner, close to 40% do buy from a dealer, and about a fifth owned from an independent dealership. So for used cars, it's much more split. And I mentioned the incentive things because a lot of incentive programs require the purchase of a new or used vehicle from a dealer. And so that makes sense for new cars. That covers most buyers. However, in this sample, it doesn't necessarily help all used car buyers. A lot of used car buyers are not buying their vehicle from sort of a dealership. And kind of importantly, the lowest income buyers are the ones who are buying from private owners. So these people here are kind of excluded from incentive programs, but they're maybe the ones that need the incentive the most if we want them to get an EV. Okay, I'll briefly show one slide on barriers to EV adoption, and then I'm going to hand over to Maha, who's going to talk more broadly about like perceptions of EVs, knowledge and consideration. So we kind of measure barriers to EVs in lots of different ways. One way is just asking everybody what they think. What I'm showing here is we ask people if they thought about buying an EV. This is specifically for battery electric vehicles. And if they say they've thought about buying one, we ask them if they've made a decision. And if they decided to not buy an electric vehicle, we ask them why they didn't buy an electric vehicle. And this is kind of a way of us measuring more experience barriers rather than some sort of like abstract perceptions of electric vehicles from people who don't really know or understand them. So these are things that people kind of hurdles people have come across that have prevented them from buying an EV. So 20% of people who said they have considered an EV decided to not buy one. Another 20% said they decided to buy one, but they haven't yet, and then another 60% were still deciding. But the most common reason, the most common barrier that stops someone buying an EV is, according to this, a lack of infrastructure, both at home, which is in the gold here, and also in public places. And then a lot of people didn't specify the location, but kind of reading between the lines, I think a lot of this is at home. That was followed by purchase cost, and driving range, and also the availability of a vehicle, the cost to install a home charger, and some lesser reported barriers. We also look at this for plug-in hybrids. For plug-in hybrids, the most common concern was vehicle cost, vehicle availability, and then vehicle cost, vehicle availability, and then infrastructure access. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Maha, who's going to talk about some more broad perceptions.
Hey, Scott. While Maha is opening her slides, there were a couple questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you all want to do questions now or wait until the end to take questions.
I think if it's a quick question, I could answer it now. If it's a more broad, like kind of high-level discussion type thing, we would do it at the end. So I haven't read them yet.
Okay, so maybe let's do all the questions at the end so you have a chance to read them while Maha presents, and we can go from there, if that works.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name's Maha, and I'm going to be covering going over the analysis that we did to explore what households' awareness, knowledge, and perceptions of EVs are. All right, so to conduct this analysis, we implemented a step 3 latent class analysis. So the first step involves building a latent class model based on a set of response variables. So what that means is we are looking to identify distinct groups, also known as latent classes, based on observed responses in the survey. Step 2 involves assigning each survey respondent to one of these latent classes based on their probability of belonging to each class. And then finally, we build a multinomial logistic regression model where we're looking at the relationship between class membership and a set of other variables. So to build these latent classes, we looked at sort of three themes. The first had to do with perceptions. So survey respondents were presented with 9 statements, and they were asked to rate their response on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. These statements had to do with ability to charge at home, EV range, safety, environmental impact, maintenance, ability to charge, as well as questions about or statements relating to respondent knowledge of EVs and incentives. So there were 2 main sort of perceptions that survey respondents reacted more negatively to. The first had to do with BEV range. So 17% strongly disagreed and 30% disagreed when asked whether or not BEVs travel far enough before needing to be charged. The other perception that also sort of elicited strong, like negative responses had to do with whether or not there are enough places to charge electric vehicles. So 23% strongly disagreed to the statement and 35% disagreed. And so these are 2 concerns that are going to pop up throughout our analysis. The second set of variables that we were looking at when building these latent classes had to do with considerations and knowledge. So respondents were asked if they had considered buying a BEV. 27% stated that they have not and would not. 50% either haven't considered but might consider it in the future or have considered it and not taken any real steps. 7% of survey respondents already have or have had a BEV. We also included a variable that had to do with respondent knowledge. So we asked survey respondents to name the make and model of an EV, and if they were able to and then we scored these responses. So 43% were correctly able to name a make and model. The remaining 57% were either partially correct or incorrect. And then the final variable that we were looking at was whether or not survey respondents supported the 100% ZEV regulation. So 23% were strongly opposed to this regulation, while around 50% were somewhat or strongly supportive of the regulation. So using these 12 variables, we were then able to identify 5 distinct groups within our survey respondents. So the first group are the active supporters, and this represents 14% of our sample. We refer to them as active because they actively think about BEVs and have stronger perceptions, and support indicates that their perceptions are more positive. So this group has considered or already own an EV. They strongly support the ZEV regulation. They have good knowledge, positive perceptions on most attributes, but they are concerned about public charging as well as range. The passive supporters, which makes up 34% of survey respondents, have thought about ZEVs, but not seriously. They're slight to strong support for the 100% ZEV regulation, mixed knowledge, neutral to more positive perceptions on attributes, which is why we consider them supporters. And they are also concerned about home and public charging as well as range. So the unengaged class, which represents 18% of our survey respondents, are individuals that haven't considered but maybe will consider EVs in the future. They are neutral towards the ZEV regulation as well as most perceptions. They also have poor knowledge compared to the other groups. So unengaged means that they have no positive, negative, or any sort of active thinking when it comes to ZEVs. The active resistors, which makes up 8% of our survey respondents, have not and will not consider purchasing a ZEV. They are very strongly opposed to the 100% ZEV regulation. They have mixed to poor knowledge and negative perceptions on almost all of the attributes, except for the perceptions related to their own knowledge of ZEVs and ZEV incentives. And then finally, the passive resistors, which makes up 27% of our survey respondents, haven't considered but maybe will consider ZEVs in the future. They are slightly opposed to the ZEV regulation. They have mixed knowledge. They have neutral to negative perceptions on most attributes, which is why we call them resistors. And they are also concerned about public charging, range, and battery degradation. So once we've identified these 5 classes, we go ahead and build a multinomial logistic regression model in order to look at the relationship between belonging to a class and these sets of variables. So our dependent variable here is a latent class, where we are treating the active supporter group as the reference category. So what that means is we are looking at the odds of belonging to any of the classes compared to belonging to the active supporter class. Independent variables that we include have to do with demographics, so income, age, education, gender, race, home ownership, vehicles per driver, as well as whether or not the individual is a new car buyer. We include attitudinal variables, so relating to environment, mixed land use, tech, cars, thoughts on waiting, sociability, and exercise. And then we also include contextual and built environment variables, so population density, charging density. And here we are specifically looking at fast chargers that are available within a 5-minute drive from the respondent's residence. We're looking at EV density, the urban versus rural nature of the census tract where the respondent resides, as well as home charging access. So the results of this model indicates that active supporters tend to be more likely to be homeowners, male, college educated, younger, and white. They tend to have an income of above 150,000 compared to all of the other classes, and they have greater charging access as well as they live in areas with higher EV density. They also tend to have more pro-environment, tech, and mixed land use attitudes. Compared to the active supporters, the passive supporters tend to be new car buyers. They have more anti-tech and anti-social attitudes, and they have less access to fast charging and home charging compared to those active supporters. The unengaged tend to have more vehicles per driver, as well as anti-tech and anti-social attitudes. They also have lower EV density and charging access compared to the active supporters. The active resistors tend to have more vehicles per driver. They tend to be used car buyers, and they have a higher income than all of the classes except for the active supporters. They tend to have stronger anti-environment, anti-weighting, and anti-mixed land use attitudes, as well as stronger pro-car attitudes. They also live in less urban areas compared to the active supporters, and they also have less charging access and EV density. The passive resistors, like the active resistors, tend to have more vehicles per driver, as well as stronger anti-environment and mixed land use attitudes. They also live in less urban areas. They have less charging access and lower EV density. So the key findings of this portion of the analysis are that around 92% of the sample is not strongly opposed to ZEV-related regulation and BEV adoption. So in other words, only 8% of our sample was actively resistant. The active supporters are most likely to live in regions with higher ZEV adoption and more access to charging. They had stronger pro-environment, tech, and mixed land use attitudes compared to all of the other classes, and they tended to be younger, home-owning, and white. The unengaged are likely to have unformed opinions on BEVs, and that was reflected in the fact that they were very neutral on a lot of the perceptions, as well as the support for ZEV, 100% ZEV sales regulation. The resistors are unlikely to purchase BEVs based on their current perceptions, but they have a high level of self-knowledge. And so when it came to their perception of their own knowledge related to BEVs and BEV incentives, they rated themselves very highly. However, when we were looking at the proportion that were able to correctly name a BEV make and model, a higher proportion answered incorrectly. So there's a bit of a difference when it comes to their perception of their knowledge versus the measure of their knowledge that we used for this analysis. And then finally, all of the classes are concerned about public charging, and several of them also have concerns about BEV range. All right. All right, that was it for me. I'm going to pass it off to Kelly now.
Good morning, everyone. So now we will transition into discussing what policy interventions might increase consideration among priority populations to purchase a BEV. And so here we are focusing specifically on battery electric vehicles. So to answer this research question, we designed a survey experiment, and we used the input elicited from the listening sessions to help inform the experiment design. So as summarized earlier by Scott, some of the top concerns reported by participants included high purchase price, lack of charging, and also battery-related concerns. So we align each of these concerns with existing policy interventions to see how they impact consideration to purchase a BEV. And so respondents, broadly speaking, were randomly shown one of 54 possible scenarios. And each of these scenarios consists of one level from each of the policy interventions. And I will get into more detail of those on the next slide. And after being shown this scenario, we asked them their likelihood to consider purchasing a BEV from very unlikely to very likely. And so some of the benefits of this design include overall low fatigue effects and also reduced social desirability bias, in addition to accommodating for low baseline knowledge of battery electric vehicles, as most respondents, again, as previously summarized, had very low awareness of this technology. So the first category of incentives includes financial incentives. And here we presented respondents with the incentive amount aligned with the Clean Cars for All incentive, as well as a 1/3 reduced Clean Cars for All incentive, compared to the reference category being no information. Next, we have various levels of charging access, and here we're comparing the cost and time associated with public level 2 to those of other locations and speed, including public fast, home, destination/work, and then a combination of both home and destination, as well as home and fast. And the key thing here is that we are providing respondents primarily just with the relative time and cost of these charging locations compared to fueling a gas car. And the last category includes battery assurance measures. And these are based off of existing or forthcoming ZEV assurance measures, including a rebate to replace a battery if it fails within the warranty period. And then also the warranty based on the Advanced Clean Cars 2 ruling, which includes 8 years or 100,000 miles. And again, here we're comparing information for these two levels compared to no information. And lastly, here we have a slide providing an example of what a respondent could have seen for this survey experiment. And up at the top, we provide them with a brief introduction to, again, introduce them to what BEVs are, how far they typically go, and their availability. And we do not specify whether it's new or used. And then here we have a possible scenario, 1 of 54. And at the bottom, we ask them their likelihood to consider purchasing a BEV on a continuous 100 to 700 scale. So we use a beta regression model with the dependent variable here being the BEV purchase likelihood. And beta regression is ideal for the dependent variable being a proportion or rate, as is the case here. And we convert the 100 to 700 scale to a 0 to 1 scale. And we control for similar categories of variables as in the MNL model, the multinomial model. And the results are interpreted similarly in terms of being odds ratios of having either higher or lower purchase consideration. And so for demographics, these include income, age, education, and a few others. For context, we have EVs per 1,000 vehicles, as well as urban versus rural. And for the BEV related perceptions, we reduced the 9 indicators into 4 factors, and then lastly, the same attitudinal variables as previously shown. And so I will go ahead and just show the significant variables which were associated with having higher purchase consideration. And so for financial incentives, this includes information on the Clean Cars for All incentive, whereas the 1/3 reduced version was not statistically significant. For charging access, we have compared to public level 2, we did not find that fast charging by itself was statistically significant. Compared to home charging, destination/work charging, and then combinations of home and work and home and fast being statistically significant compared to public level 2. We did not find any of the battery assurance measures to be statistically significant compared to no information. And in regards to demographics, we found that younger respondents, in addition to households earning $150,000 or more, and also new car buyers, were all more likely to have higher purchase consideration compared to older respondents and lower income households, and also those who buy used cars. For the contextual variable, we found that more EVs per 1,000 vehicles, or those living in regions with more EVs, were more likely to consider a BEV. Most of the perception variables related to BEVs were statistically significant. And then we also found some attitudes, including pro-environmentalism, mixed land use, being waiting tolerant, meaning that waiting is not perceived to be a waste of time for respondents, and then also being pro-traveling for leisure. And then since we're specifically interested in the effect of the interventions, we have here shown the marginal effects yielded from the model, and these are interpreted as the increase in, or the percent increase in purchase consideration for each of the interventions. So we can see that relative to no information, the full Clean Cars for All incentive increases consideration by about 5 points. And then in the middle for charging, we can sort of see visually the minimal difference between public level 2 and public fast in regard to likelihood to consider buying a BEV. And we can see that the other locations elicit a higher probability of considering a BEV. And then lastly, over on the right, the battery assurance measures, which weren't statistically significant. And so just to provide a summary of the key findings. So firstly, for financial incentives. So while a 5% increase in purchase consideration may seem small in and of itself, we do find that this effect is comparable to about a 100,000 increase in household income. So put that way, the effect does seem relatively large. And so regarding access to charging, we find that public fast charging by itself does not seem to increase purchase consideration relative to public level 2, whereas home and workplace charging are positively associated with higher purchase consideration. And there's some supporting literature to this finding, with several other studies not finding any relationship between both the density of public charging and also awareness of public charging with BEV purchase consideration. And lastly, regarding the insignificance of the battery assurance measures, so these this sort of suggests that they may be ineffective in increasing BEV purchase consideration. But we also find that respondents have predominantly not yet formed opinions of battery quality, so it sort of represents an opportunity for engagement in this area. And just for some even bigger picture concluding remarks, it's important to keep in mind that while some of these policy interventions were found to statistically or to significantly increase purchase consideration, they actually account for a very small amount of purchase consideration in and of themselves. And so we find that consideration is more greatly explained by demographics, including income and buying new cars, and also having positive perceptions of BEVs. And so lastly, while these incentives might be able to increase purchase consideration, consumers need to be aware of these incentives in order for them to be effective, because that is ultimately what this experiment was testing, was the effect of providing information. And so this sort of suggests that engagement needs to supplement these interventions in order to increase consumers' awareness of them. And with that, I will pass it back off to Scott for some more concluding remarks.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay. Yeah, so I just have 4 kind of slides just to kind of wrap up everything that we've spoken about, just kind of so we can kind of like summarize, and since there's been so many things we've been talking about. So I think first thing to say is most people are not thinking about buying a ZEV, even in 2024 when we did the survey. And again, most people cannot name a ZEV still. The most prominent barriers we see are low knowledge, a lack of home or public charging, high vehicle costs, some concerns about battery reliability, though, as Kelly said, a lot of people still are forming opinions about that. There are still concerns about range, and as well, perceived lack of benefits of owning an EV, partially because of the high cost of electricity. However, that being said, like as Maha was showing, only about 9% of this sample did we characterize as being sort of actively resistant to ZEVs. So very few respondents are outright opposed to ZEVs and ZEV policy, which I think is kind of a positive takeaway. Then as Kelly showed, incentives and infrastructure can meaningfully increase people's consideration, provided they know about them. And then a kind of a final takeaway that's kind of a little bit buried in the details is household attributes like income, education, the type of house people live in, gender, race and ethnicity, and so on. All of those things are related to people's perceptions, their knowledge, their consideration, and also how they respond to this kind of incentive. And on the other hand, where people live, the census tract which they live in, and the type of tract that they live in is not correlated to these things, which you control for household attributes. And so that's kind of important to think about when we design in programs. It's not necessarily about where people live, it's more about like the household and the individual in terms of like identifying who needs support and how they respond to that support. Okay, so I think just onto some policy implications. First, kind of broadly, I think, engage with communities, ask them what they want and need, align programs with what they are asking for, their needs, and also with their existing behavior, so they don't have to make multiple behavior changes in one go. I think broadly, we often see low knowledge of EVs and a low understanding and engagement with them. I think that's something in particular we need to be spending more time and money thinking about. Federally, we've spent $2 billion on incentives just this year. The National Infrastructure Program is about $5 billion this year. So we're spending billions of dollars on infrastructure and incentives, but we're spending very, very little on actually educating people and even making them aware of those programs. And finally, yeah, consider the households, not just where people live. Sorry, I'll just mention this process here. Incentives and infrastructure, they help people decide about getting an EV and implement one. This is the process people go to when they buy a new technology. The first stage is awareness. And so we're spending a lot of time kind of down here. And I think, the reason we want to do more engagement is that's the first thing people do when they are evaluating or thinking about a new technology. So I think just want to highlight that again. Then more specifically, continue to provide incentives. We see in this research and also in, there was a recent report published by researchers at Davis and Berkeley, which was done for CARB, evaluating different incentive programs, showing that they are very effective, especially the low-income programs like Clean Cars for All. So continue to provide them. Align them with people's behavior. One example of that is you have to buy from a dealer. A lot of used car buyers that excludes from participating in the program. And again, like make sure people know about them. we consistently see a lack of home or public charging as a barrier to EV ownership. What we do about that, I think people are still debating. I think if you were to ask me, I'd say we should focus more on home charging. You see that in the results here. And also other studies show that home charging is the most influential in the decision to buy an EV. It's the most frequently used, it's the most convenient, it's the cheapest. People who have home charging report having a much better EV ownership experience than those that have public charging. And again, like public charging, we don't see that it has a significant impact on people's consideration, potentially because it is expensive, less convenient, potentially less available. You know, there's reliability issues, a lot of different things we could talk about there. You know, fast charging is supplemental, home charging, or even maybe at someone's work or school or somewhere they go regularly, that is like the foundational charging we should be focusing on. As Kelly showed, the warranties and rebates don't appear to increase people's interest in buying an EV. We don't want to conclude that we shouldn't have those, but we do want to say like maybe that's not a way to encourage people to buying EVs. However, once people have bought them, we may need those to help kind of lower the risk or the potential burden that someone could have if an EV were to fail. And then finally, a lot of households buy used vehicles. The used market lags the new market. And so I think continuing to support the new EV market through sales regulations, incentives, and so on, that will at some point help the used vehicle market and trickle down to these lower income and disadvantaged communities. Okay, yeah, I think final thoughts in terms of these research questions we posed at the start. You know, awareness and knowledge is low, but we do think households are amenable to ZEVs. Both they responded well to the experiment where we showed them different incentives, and also in the listening sessions, people did, after meaningful engagement, become more interested in buying them. However, there are real barriers, and I think whether and how those are addressed depends on what we do. It depends on the amount of support given to communities. It depends on how the programs are designed, and it depends on people being aware and understanding and knowing that there are programs out there that can help support them. Yeah, and I think finally, again, like EVs are not going to be the only solution. People also really want to see more investments in transit in their communities, as well as communities being more walkable to them. Yeah, I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you all for listening. Thanks again to CARB for funding this research and Lisa for like managing the project, and everybody as well for kind of supporting this research.
Thanks, Scott, and a lot for that presentation, and Maha and Kelly, that was really informative, and you guys all did a great job presenting a lot of research that went in the past few years, so really appreciate that. So folks we have about a little less than 10 minutes for some questions. We might, if people want to raise their hands, you can do that, but also let's just get started. Some people had some questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with this first one. What conditions explain how active resistors have lower home charging access if they have higher incomes?
Yeah, maybe that one's for Maha. I think that group of people, they were more likely to live in a single family home. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Maha. And so you would expect potentially, because they live in a single family home, they would be more likely to charge. However, I think potentially because of their active resistance, they are sort of saying like, oh no, we can't charge, I don't want an EV, no, I can't charge one. And they're kind of immediately dismissing that question, or like even thinking about whether or not they could charge at home.
Yeah, and we were also looking specifically at comparing whether they had an outlet specifically for EV charging versus something for level 1, 2, or no charging.
Great, thanks. I know there was a question about how long the rebate is good for, up to 5,000. There's so many different rebates, and the landscape has changed a lot with rebates. So maybe when we post information, we can try to provide some links to rebate information, or Jeremy, I can follow up with you specifically, because that's like a very kind of, could be a long answer, and things are changing a lot right now. So there's a question, are there counties having issues installing fast chargers? with their local seal protocol and weights and measures approval. Jose, I feel like that also might be something we can follow up with you on. So I will make sure to connect with you following this webinar. What percent of EV owners or EV supporters have incomes much lower than 150,000? Are those combined household incomes? So I'll let you.
Yeah, all of the incomes we reported were household income. So, you know, often there's 2 people household, an income for 2 people. The sample isn't EV owners, but I can tell you from like other studies, I think about a third of EV owners have an income of less than that, a household income. But I can dig into some EV ownership data to take a look at that.
Thanks. There's a question from Margaret. Hi, Margaret. Was there any discussion about low maintenance or the fact that there's no need for oil changes or smog checks? Did that come up? Or was that just was there just lack of knowledge?
Yeah, we discussed that in the listing sessions. So we kind of, you know, people asked about maintenance and we spoke about that. I think people did understand that, but they were concerned about the potential for sort of battery failures, even though, you know, research is showing that batteries are going to be quite reliable and maybe last for as long or longer than internal combustion engine vehicles, like 200,000 miles or so, especially EVs that are being sold today. There still does seem to be a perception that this is a big sort of potential financial risk. And so that kind of, for some people, was overcoming this benefit of like not having to change the oil or like have like engine air filter replacements and stuff like that. Yeah, and I noticed the question above. This is probably a good one for Kelly about like gasoline consumption spending.
Yeah, I'm going to do that one next. Yeah, was the amount of gasoline consumption spending on gasoline considered any difference among drivers based on how much gasoline they use?
I think overall, across income groups at least, like there actually wasn't that much difference in either VMT or gas spending. Yeah, so there was actually similar spending on that. Of course, higher income had much more fuel efficient cars overall. And also just speaking to the income of BEV owners too, just the previous question. Just overall, the BEV owners in the sample have a higher average income than like the average new car buyer in the sample. So yeah, there's that as well.
Yeah, and we did also look at total vehicle spending, so gasoline, maintenance, insurance, and any like financing or lease costs across income categories. And we did find there's a big sort of variation. So like higher income households, they only spend maybe 5% of their income on those things, but there were some households in these communities spending, you know, up to 50% of their income on only vehicle ownership costs. So there's certainly some people who are kind of, you know, burdened by the high cost of vehicle ownership.
Thanks. It looks like we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to, I don't know if we'll get to everyone today, but we'll try to figure out how to, you know, to address them and reach out to you if we don't. So price and charging have always been the barriers. Education or awareness can do little to improve these 2 key issues. What can we actually do to improve adoption? Also, manufacturers account for incentives by raising prices.
Yeah, I agree. Price and charging have always been barriers. I think I would disagree that education awareness can do little to address those things, because, you know, remember, price is a perceived barrier and charging is a perceived barrier. Whether or not it's an actual barrier is kind of different. A lot of people don't necessarily understand that they can charge from home. They don't know that there's, even if there are fast chargers in their communities, they don't know that they're there. And again, they don't know like the EV prices have fallen, and they also don't know the incentives available. And so I think education and awareness can actually address those barriers when it's a perceived barrier. So I would say like we should be doing education and awareness to improve that in itself, but also to help address these other barriers. Like, you know, we said range is perceived negatively, but most people can drive an EV very comfortably from almost all of their trips. And so I think, you know, education awareness can change a lot of things. And we haven't really done it at a large scale yet to see what effect it can have.
Thanks, Scott. And Sharice, I'll connect you with the researchers. And there's a question, did the study consider V2H or I know vehicle to grid options or possibilities, V2H or V2G options or possibilities?
Yeah, we didn't ask about that. We decided not to go into those issues because sample is general population, and we found in other studies that the general population does not really understand those things. If you were to study those things, you'd probably want to ask existing EV owners what they think about them.
Yeah, a lot more questions, and we have 2 minutes left. I see here a question about, do you think curbside charging would be similar to home charging in terms of convenience?
Yeah, I think it could be. Yeah, when we say home charging, we just mean like it doesn't have to be on a driveway. It's wherever someone parks their car while they are at home. You know, when you're sleeping, where's your car? That's a home charger. And that can be on a driveway, on the street. It could be in a shared parking lot or wherever. And so I think it could be, if it was implemented well.
And the data will be available sometime next year, and we can let you all know when it's available. It says, will the data be available by region? So we'll be working with UC Davis to make it available. And then, does the team have recommendations about how to build basic awareness of the technology and benefits across the US, especially given the federal funding may be more constrained in future years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's quite a long answer. I think one thing programs like ACC2, which will encourage automakers to make more electric vehicles, if they get to the point where they have to try and create more demand, they would then become motivated to start doing education and outreach. I would say like we don't have a good answer right now of like what the messaging should be and what it could like what kind of information you want to tell people. That's kind of a future project we're working on right now. But I mean, there's a lot of organizations now working on this. You know, CARB kind of helped start Velos, like they are doing this. I would say like they probably have some insights on what is like a good message and sort of campaign.
Yeah, and it
But
looks
I
like
would just say
Margaret and
more than
Sarah.
we're doing now.
Yeah. I think with that, I really appreciate all the great information that you all shared today, Scott, Maha, and Kelly. And thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. I really appreciate your engagement and questions. And if we didn't get to your question, I really apologize, and we will follow up and try to get you an answer. I'll also make sure to follow up with everyone with the links to the slides and the recording when that's available. So. And the final report, which we should have in the next few weeks. And I'm not sure how long that takes to get posted, but we'll also have the final report. And you guys can all dive into all the information there as well. So thank you very much. And everyone have a happy holiday season, a great day. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. You can also include mine, Maha's, and Kelly's emails if people want to email us. We'll have to chat with them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.